Hello, my name's Gavin Menzies and I'm the author of 3 books, and I'd like to very briefly tell you about them. The first book was called 1421, The Year China Discovered the World, and that book came about as a complete accident. Marcella, my wife, and I decided we'd go to China to celebrate our silver wedding anniversary 20 years ago, and we turned up in the Forbidden City, in Beijing, on New Year's Eve, and we learned that the Chinese emperor had inaugurated this huge Forbidden City in 1421, and he'd sent a great fleet of ships all around the world to bring kings and emperors and princes from around the world back to Beijing for this inauguration. And this came as a great surprise to me because 1421 was 70 years before Columbus. My publishers, Transworld, asked if we'd create a website to gather all the evidence that streamed in, and we did just that, and the website was very, very popular. Now, one of the most recurring criticisms we had was that I'd been too simplistic, that in fact there was evidence that the Chinese had gone to Europe many times, and they brought an enormous amount of new ideas, inventions, discoveries and so on, not only about science and mathematics and astronomy, but about world exploration. And we were told that the Chinese delegation had met the Pope and his representatives in the year 1434. So my second book was called 1434, The Year a Magnificent Chinese Fleet Sailed to Italy and Ignited the Renaissance. And that was published by HarperCollins in 2008. That book in itself was very controversial, as controversial as 1421 was, and a number of people who came to our website said, look, once again, you've been too simplistic. You've said they went to Europe and they went to the Americas, but what you haven't said is that the Chinese have been sailing backwards and forwards from China to the Americas for hundreds and hundreds of years, long, long before 1421. So in 2006, a group of friends and I decided we'd go to America and we would check into the previous Chinese voyages over 1,000 years. And we did just that, and we came back and I decided to incorporate all this new evidence in a revised version of 1421. And I did so over about a 3-month period, and I got very, very tired, and I couldn't write, I got terrible arthritis and so on. So Marcella and I decided we'd go off to Crete, spend Christmas in Crete. And whilst we were there, we found to our amazement that a great palace in the south of Crete, a place called Phaistos, which is a glorious palace, had been built in 2000 BC. And we researched this, and we found that it was indeed true. And it was evidence because the people who built this palace sailed backwards and forwards to Egypt and brought gifts to the pharaohs and returned with gifts. So there was trade between the central Mediterranean and Africa 4,000 years before Magellan and Da Gama. And this was an extraordinary revelation. And I wrote a book about that, which was called Lost Treasures of Atlantis, and it describes these Cretan people called Minoans who built an empire which stretched from North America, Great Lakes, to southern India between 2000 BC and 1450 BC. And that book was published by Orion, or is going to be published by Orion. They bought the rights earlier this year. Now, the common denominator of all these books is that there have been voyages across the Pacific and across the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus, and there have been a great number of these voyages, not one-offs, hundreds and hundreds of voyages. Excuse me. So in my research, I relied upon the intellectual evidence which was provided by 2 professors, Emeritus Professor John Sorensen and Emeritus Professor Carl Johannesson, who had spent their lifetimes, over 50 years, researching transatlantic and trans-Pacific voyages before Columbus, and they published major books about this. Now, I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and so what I decided to do was to have a session at the Royal Geographical Society in which they could put forward to publishers what was written in their books. I would invite publishers to meet them and journalists to meet them, and hopefully we would be able to sell their books to a major international publisher worldwide. And that took place, that talk at the Royal Geographical Society took place on the 16th of April 2010. At the moment, Sorensen and Johannesson, and in a much more modest way, me, are three people amongst thousands and thousands of historians who we think are putting out what's the true story. Now there are, as I say, it's thousands and thousands of people who think this like we do, but they are being stifled and muffled by the conventional historians who continue to stick to this ridiculous assertion that all transatlantic voyages started with Columbus. So the aim was that both Sorensen and Johannesson would speak about their joint book, World Trade and Biological Exchanges Before 1492. John Sorensen has titled his talk to the Royal Geographical Society, Death of a Paradigm. Now, I didn't know what paradigm meant before he wrote that, but what a paradigm apparently is, it's an widely accepted view, which later turns out to be wrong. And he's arguing that it'll probably be the same with his and Johannesson's research. They've done it, it's there, people can see that the old stories that Columbus discovered America are complete, absolute nonsense once they read Sorensen and Johannesson's books.
For more than a century, American archaeology has been dominated by the paradigm that ancient civilization in the Western Hemisphere developed from simple cultures solely due to evolutionary processes independent of influence from civilizations of the Old World. By the late 19th century, many natural scientists accepted that view. In the first third of the 20th, the isolationist view was reinforced by the anti-foreign zeitgeist in the USA that resulted in legislation barring Orientals from immigrating. S.G. Morley, the leading Maya archaeologist, in 1924 reflected the xenophobia and isolationism of that period in his statement, "There is, quote, no vestige, no infinitesimal trace of the old world to detract from the genius of our Native American Indian mind," unquote. Quoting again, "There is no room for foreign origins here," unquote. Expressed in less flamboyant terms, that position remains essentially unchanged among archaeologists in the 21st century.
And Professor Sorensen then went on to describe the broad scale of the evidence in his new book.
In our 2009 book, World Trade and Biological Exchanges Before 1492, we have established that 124 species of plants, animals, and infectious organisms were definitely present in both hemispheres before Columbus.
I then read Professor Johannesson's talk, which he'd planned to give, which outlined the enormous amount of evidence which explained and gave details of transatlantic voyages between the Old World and New before Columbus. Professor John L. Sorensen and I, after looking for many years at accumulated peer-reviewed journals, scholarly tomes, as well as the popular press and student seminar papers, realized that there is a wealth of evidence available to definitively show significant contact between the Americas long before the northwestern European expeditions, and more recently than 8,000 years ago, our most ancient dated archaeological data. By concentrating on evidence related to the transfer of plants and animals, rather than concentrating on shared cultural traits such as pottery, weaving, and metallurgy, Sorensen and I became convinced there was so much evidence of the transfer of organisms, especially the domesticated ones, that there could be no serious doubt of the intentional dispersal of flora and fauna across the oceans before Columbus. Maize, annona, and sunflower were transported by sail to India and are found sculpted on panels that make up the temple walls
on about 100 Hoysala dynasty temples in India, we can begin to study the other seed crops imported into India, a total of 50 from America in our book, with the finding of sunflower carvings on temples in Karnataka. We were assigned a young PhD student and found a group of temples with a whole class of art students climbing all over the several temples and sketching the intricacies of sculptures. Once the instructor for the group was told that we were looking for any American plants carved in the sculptured walls, she came and showed us this scene with a mature sunflower in full seed with a long-tailed Indian parrot sitting on the flower head and eating the mature seeds, as any self-respecting parrot would do. The third plant of American origin found in India before Columbus's voyages is the annona, one of the sweet sops. When we look for the record of annona in India, we find Annonia squamosa around 700 BC. It had been on other sculptures, but they found it in archaeological digs also. The most obvious products to have been transported in the earliest trade activities were the plants with chemicals that caused the mind to play tricks. Tobacco was taken from America to southern China about 5,000 years ago. As I said, it became better known in India and Egypt by about 1200 BC, that is 3,200 years ago. Forensic analysis of chemicals in the flesh, hair, and bone of Egyptian royal mummies indicates that 8 of the 9 analyzed from the Munich Museum had been using tobacco, coca, and marijuana. The pharaohs used these medicines or drugs over a span of 1,450 years, and metabolic remains are found in these royal personages, even in children from 1070 BC to 395 AD. Tobacco and cocaine had to have been carried regularly by ship from America, where these plants originated and were domesticated, to Egypt for 1,450 years.
Taking all this evidence in the round, John Sorensen concluded,
our demonstration of multiple transoceanic voyages means that no longer is it rational to believe that the Americas constituted a separate sphere without historical links to the Old World. The world was significantly one long before modern globalization. Johannesson and I have shown that for the isolationist view of ancient American history.
Our research has only just begun. Even with evidence of 124 plants, and including the 8 animals and 20 microorganisms, diseases and parasites, there is so much more research and collection to do.
well, now we've got to the situation where we have any amount of evidence produced by Sorensen and Johannesson of transatlantic and trans-Pacific voyages before Columbus. We can show beyond doubt there were thousands of these voyages, and it's absolutely ridiculous to claim, as conventional historians are claiming, that Columbus discovered America. Now, if I can popularize this thought, Columbus is said to have discovered America. Where's the proof? There is no proof at all. There's proof that he sailed to America in 1492, not that he discovered the place. How can you discover a place when you've actually got a map of it before you set off? Columbus accepts he had a map showing him the way. Nobody doubts that. He got it from the Pope's representative, Toscanelli, who himself got it from the Chinese. So Columbus never claimed that he discovered America at all. Furthermore, he wasn't going off on a voyage of discovery. In the contract which he signed with the King of Spain, Ferdinand, he was going to be viceroy of the land across the Atlantic, the other side of the Atlantic. So everyone knew about it. So if you're going to be viceroy of a place, which is, everyone knows is already there, and it's in your contract before you set sail in 1492, how on earth can you be said to have discovered the place? It's completely ridiculous. Now, what I feel is that so far, conventional historians have managed to produce this web of fantasy that Columbus discovered America, Magellan was the first to sail around the world, and so on and so forth, without being challenged. My books are real popular blockbusters, and they do challenge them head on. So they've got to answer the questions. Now, once we can get Sorensen and Johannesson's books out to a wide public, and they can see meticulous research by two emeritus professors who spent a lifetime on this research, then that stage we will change history. People will realize they've been led up the garden path, taught all this rubbish about Columbus, and at long last we'll get true histories taught in schools. And I say it's high time that happens.